All right, welcome everybody. Today is a super fun topic. Well, maybe not. Contingencies, right, in real estate contracts. And there's a handout for those of you that are looking for a handout. You're in the right spot. And I hope my copy is the same one I shared with Angela. Yeah, anyhow. And what I wanted to do, can everybody see a screen that says Mastering Contingencies, the California Agent's Guide?
Yes.
Yes, is Angela nodding? Yes, yes, okay. So,
Yeah.
okay, good. I have too many screens and too many things that have popped up. So, I'm going to start, we're going to look at some of the forms, and it occurred to me that I left off one of the forms that we'll look at, but we'll see if we need to see the real one or not. So just to start with, there's a little bit of a discussion I wanted about what contingencies are and how they're removed. And then we're going to look at some of the specific forms that you might have to fill out in order to, create contingencies and remove contingencies, and discuss some of the times when the contingencies never go away, right? Or may never go away. And a lot of this has to do with experience that I have with various real estate agents over this particular subject. I've got a transaction going on right now where this is becoming a big point. A contingency is a if in a contract. And in fact, a better way to put it is a contingency is a only if. And only if. I'm willing to buy your house, but only if I can get a loan. I'm willing to buy your house, but only if it appraises for the purchase price or more. I'm willing to buy your house, but only if the HOA documents don't scare me away, or only if the preliminary title report looks clean, or only if I can get insurance for the property, or only if when I investigate it, I don't find things I don't like, right? And there's a bunch of these. These are the only ifs in the contract. Now, this is in California. Another way to think of a contingency, I talk about off ramps. A better metaphor might be escape hatches, right? You're in a boat, the boat is in a storm, the boat is sinking, and you have escape hatches. Now, every time you remove a contingency, you're basically nailing an escape hatch closed. So you remove the appraisal contingency, that's not an escape anymore. You remove the loan contingency, that's not an escape. And when you've removed all contingencies, you've nailed shut most of the ways to get out of the sinking boat. It depends on why the boat is sinking, right? Which I'm going to talk about. The other thing that is important to know is that in California, a contingency is considered a condition precedent and a condition as opposed to a condition subsequent. So what that means is that in order for this to be a legally binding contract, before that can happen, then the contingency has to be removed. It has to precede the creation of a complete binding contract that's going to close in a real estate transaction. A condition subsequent would be something that would happen later. Now, what that means in what might be more normal terms is you'll hear real estate agents say things like, well, you didn't remove your contingency on time, we're out of contract, right? I just, again, went through the certification program to be a California Association of Realtors form trainer. And I listened to the lawyers complaining about this because they hear it all the time on their legal hotline. Agents call up and say, well, we're out of contract. That's not true, right? So if you have a contingency and it was due today and you don't remove it today, nothing happens. Nothing changes, right? You just didn't meet a deadline. We are not out of contract, right? We're still in contract until something else happens. Now, the reason why this is important is that it's possible that if you remove your contingencies, let me put it this way. If you do not remove your contingencies and you leave the contract because of the contingency was not met, you get your deposit back almost every time. If you've removed all of your contingencies and you still can't close, you could lose your deposit. But it's not an automatic forfeiture. Agents sometimes think this is, well, they didn't remove their contingencies, we're canceling them, we're going to keep the deposit. Not that fast, not so easy. Well, anyhow, something like that. So if the buyer does not remove their contingencies and they're given the notice to perform, we're going to talk about that, and they don't perform in 2 days, and then you send them a cancellation, the seller has a right to cancel the contract. But they can't cancel escrow simply by doing that. In order for escrow to be canceled, the buyer and the seller have to sign something. In order for the seller to get the buyer's deposit as liquidated damages, one of 3 things would have to happen. Number 1, the buyer would have to sign a form giving the deposit to the seller. They are reluctant to do that. Number 2, it could go to arbitration and the arbitrator could award the deposit to the seller. Or number 3, it could go to court and the court could award the deposit to the seller. But if one of those 3 things doesn't happen, the deposit just sits there, doesn't go anywhere. So it isn't an automatic forfeiture. The title company, escrow company is not just going to wire the deposit to the seller. You have to get the buyer to agree to give up the deposit, which, as I mentioned, is sometimes tough. California, not all states do this. And by the way, there was a time way back in the dark ages when California had a passive removal choice for contingencies. Now, what passive removal says is that if we have a 10-day inspection contingency and 10 days come and go, and the buyer hasn't done anything, their contingency is automatically removed. That hasn't been around for a really long time. I mean, we're talking, I don't want to say, a really long time. I think it was like the 1990s. So I've heard. I was too young to remember that. But it's been a really long time. So the current contract form, which has been around for decades, says the removal of a contingency has to be active. Not just that the time period has come and gone, but that the buyer signed something that says, I remove that contingency. Right? Buyer doesn't sign anything. You give the buyer a 2-day notice to perform. They don't perform. You cancel the contract. You have to give them their money back. If they remove the contingency and then can't close, now you have perhaps the ability to get to their deposit, but it's not as easy as you would think. So it has to be active. We have a form for this, which I'm going to show you, called the C.A.R. form, or the contingency removal form. The core contingencies, the big one is the investigation contingency. The wording of the investigation contingency is, and I quote, the buyer's acceptance of the condition of the property and any other matter affecting the property is a contingency of this agreement. By the way, if you want to have fun with forms, right, which is what I used to call my series, but I was only one having fun, you could print out, or use a digital program, but there's a reason I might say print out a copy of the residential purchase agreement, and then get some color highlighting pens, maybe 4 or 5. And the first thing you're going to do is go through the contract and you're looking for the phrase, is a contingency of this agreement. And every time you see that phrase, highlight it, let's say in yellow. The other thing that you could do if you're having fun with this is you're going to look for every place it says seller shall, and every place that would be a different color, and every place it says buyer shall. And by the time you've done that, you would have seen in the RPA, the residential purchase agreement, all the contingencies and all the obligations that the buyer and the seller both have. It's something I do because I don't have a social life and have trouble sleeping. But you get the idea. That's something you would need to know. Now, the investigation contingency, you're supposed to use good faith. So I had a listing, and the buyer makes an offer, and the buyer does not have an appraisal contingency, and they don't have a loan contingency, but they have an investigation contingency. Right? The property doesn't appraise. The buyer wants to renegotiate, wants to get out. Appraisal is not a contingency. So the buyer's agent sends me this, we're backing out using the investigation contingency, and they gave two reasons. One was that there wasn't enough room in the backyard to put in a kidney-shaped pool. And two, that the 3-car garage, half of the third parking place, was really a half of it wasn't as big as the other two, so it was really like 2.5, not 3. And they sent it to me and saying, we used our investigation contingency, give us our money back. And I said, no, you're not getting your money back. And the reason was, I said it wasn't in good faith. And the reason I said it wasn't in good faith is because the two things they told me were things that they saw when they showed the property. In other words, when they showed the property, they saw the backyard and they saw the garage. So they were using something that they already knew about when they made the offer as a way to get out of the contract. That's not good faith. So what that would mean under the investigation contingency is that you discover something you did not know. Now, if you're on my team, by the way, and you're going to use the investigation contingency, then, just let me know. Let's talk about it, perhaps, because you have to be a little more creative. For example, you say something like, well, we drove by the property, one night, and it was noisy and there were a lot of rough looking people. Well, how could they prove that's not true? Or we check the crime reports and we see that somebody has stolen bicycles in the area and we've got an expensive bicycle, so we don't want to live with bicycle thieves. How would they know? Or we looked at the school rankings and the school rankings weren't very good and we want a better school, right? You understand things that you could argue you did not know when you entered into the contract. Right, which is, by the way, particularly in Silicon Valley, but a good practice everywhere, is we try to give the buyer everything in advance. We upload everything, right? Because if we tell them about it before they make the offer, then it is arguable it's not in good faith to use those items as a way to get out. It includes physical inspections, a general home inspection, termite inspection, specialized assessment, roof, sewer, lateral, pool, other major systems. A good idea, if you're a listing agent or a buyer's agent, and hopefully you're one of the two, is to always do a search for local area disclosures. For example, I'm in Morgan Hill. And if you were to say local area disclosures for Morgan Hill, you'll find that Morgan Hill has a sewer lateral disclosure requirement, right? It's in the law. If you're in Santa Cruz, not only do they have a sewer lateral requirement, they have a low flow plumbing requirement. Now you might say, well, isn't that true throughout the state? Yeah, but in Santa Cruz County, they send somebody to go look at your toilet and your shower, and they send an inspector. And if it doesn't pass, then you have to fix it. So it's always good if you're the agent. And by the way, courts have ruled that real estate agent knowledge of local area disclosures is something that is considered a minimum standard for which you could be sued for negligence. You want to know what are, and these are called point of sale ordinances, what is actually required, because if there's a sewer lateral requirement for certification, Monterey has one for energy use, there's a bunch of these, and it isn't addressed in the disclosures. You may not want to remove all of your contingencies because there's, well, maybe, I think the last one I did in Morgan Hill had $9,000 worth of sewer lateral work. Document review. So investigation includes not just hiring inspectors, and by the way, you can do anything you want, right? You can have a property inspection, a termite inspection, and for those of you that are new to this, termite inspections don't necessarily mean termites. Right? It means wood destroying pests and organisms. And the pests are, well, they're insects. And the insects in California that eat wood are termites and wood boring beetles. I have a transaction on my team going on right now where there's no termites, but there are wood boring beetles eating away at the wood. And also includes rot, because what's happening when wood is rotting is microorganisms are eating the wood, and fungus, because fungus also is eating the wood, but not mold, because mold does not eat wood. Just saying, right? So you can get all the inspections. By the way, I have a transaction going on right now where we're going to have a lead paint inspection. We're going to have an asbestos inspection. You can do anything you want as long as you don't damage the property. I've had 2 transactions where the buyer arranged for a, what's the best way to put it? Ghostbusters, 2 different types. These are 2 different clients. One of them sent this guy out and he's standing in front of the house and they're evil spirits, and another one, they were chanting and walking around in the room, burning some stuff. You can knock yourself out, right? I don't judge, right? You want to have a ghost inspection, go ahead, right? So the investigation contingency says you can have just about any inspection you want. In fact, there's a list of them, which is a form called seller inspect or buyer inspection elections, BIE, the BIE form. And there's like 2 columns of all the different stuff. I've had asbestos inspections and lead paint inspections before. So part of the investigation contingency, and by the way, we in the business sometimes call it the inspection contingency, but it's more accurate to say investigation because it also includes the review of seller documents, the HOA documents, the transfer disclosure statement, the seller property questionnaire, fire hardening and defensible space, earthquake, safety, bracing, lead, there's a whole bunch, and natural hazard disclosure, all that sort of stuff. Again, if you're a smart listing agent, you would want to get all that done in advance so you could give it to the buyer before they made the offer, because that limits the good faith inspection investigation contingency. You can investigate neighborhood conditions, crime statistics, school districts, permit history, zoning, property insurance. All of that is part of the overall investigation contingency. But it has to be in good faith, which you could argue about. Then there's, I'm covering the big ones before we get to the phone, the loan contingency. In the RPA, and I'm going to show you the parts of the RPA that deal with contingency, there's a place where you can put in what the loan amount is, what the interest rate is, what the points are. If you don't do that, then it means that if the buyer can get any loan, they still have to buy the property. Right, even if interest rates go up and they can't, they're hurting on the monthly payment, but they could do it, they still have to buy the property. So if you're in a time when interest rates could be rising, you might want to put in a cap, interest rate no greater than, points no more than, which oftentimes is very little one or something like that. If you don't do that, you're basically saying if I can get a loan, no matter what, that would remove the contingency. Then there's the appraisal contingency. There's you make it contingent on the property appraisal. I'm going to show you there's a part which is called the appraisal gap, where you can say it must appraise for X amount or more, because you're only willing to cover a certain amount. If it doesn't appraise, you get to do a couple of things. One, if you're the buyer, you can back out of the contract because it didn't appraise. Two, you could say, close enough. I want to go ahead and buy the property and just waive the appraisal contingency. Or number three, split the difference. Tell the seller, hey, lower the price and I'll buy it. Lower the price by this much and I'll buy it. But unless you make a price adjustment, I'm not going to move forward because it didn't appraise. If the contract does not require you as the buyer or the buyer's agent to give the seller a copy of the appraisal unless you're using an appraisal contingency. Now, I shouldn't mention this really because one of the people I used to mentor, he kept referring to this as the dark arts, the dark arts. But what I had a transaction a few years ago, $2 million duplex in Cupertino. It appraised for about 150,000 under what we had offered. Duplexes are harder to know. $150,000. We did not have any contingencies. No appraisal, no loan, nothing. So yeah, what I did is I sent a copy of the appraisal to the listing agent. And I told him, hey, the property didn't appraise, it's $150,000 low. And now that I've given you a copy of this document, this appraisal will become part of the document history on this property. And you're going to be obligated to show it to future buyers. And you're going to have to deal with the fact that it didn't appraise. And either you can deal with it now with us, or you can deal with it in the future. Now, why would that be called the dark art of real estate negotiation? And the part of it that I was sort of fudging on is that there is a part of the residential purchase agreement that says, here are all the documents the seller has to give to the buyer. Appraisal is not on that list. Why not? Because as you learned in real estate school, I'm sure, an appraisal is an opinion of value as opposed to a material fact. So two different appraisers could have two different opinions. But most agents don't understand that fine of a distinction. That agent's reaction was, I'm going to deny you ever sent me a copy of the appraisal. That sort of a thing. And I said, look, I use tracking software in my emails. And at that time I had an expensive one because it tracked his forward and it tracked that they had opened the document several times. I had them, but what we ended up doing was compromising, where the appraisal, we split the difference, right? I've gotten away with this a few times where we saved like $75,000, $80,000 because it didn't appraise, and the listing agent thought, well, since I have the appraisal, I guess I have to show it to people, which is not really true. But anyhow, I'm glad I'm not recording this. Document review, seller documents. The contract says that the buyer has 5 days from delivery of the documents. So this is coming up later. Even if it says you have 10 days, to remove your investigation contingency, but 5 days from when you get a receipt of the transfer disclosure statement or the seller property questionnaire, and you don't get that until day 9, you still got 4 more days for that particular, the review part of the seller documents. And again, this is why we want to give them all the documents in advance. That would include the preliminary title report, the HOA disclosures, and the review of leased or liened items. Let's say you make an offer without an investigation contingency, no contingencies, but the seller has not given you a copy of the prelim or the HOA documents, right? Then the seller gives you a copy. Do you have 5 days to back out? You wrote the offer non-contingent, but they didn't have HOA and a prelim. They give you an HOA document in the prelim. How many of you raise your hands if you're into hand raising? Most of you have turned off your cameras. I know, it's okay, but you can still raise your hand. So do you still raise your hand if you think that you have 5 days? Anybody want to? I don't see any hands. People just aren't raising. How about this? Raise your hand if you're not willing to raise your hand on any questions I ask. Are you still there? Did this freeze up? There we are. We have some people waving their hands. So does everybody get the question? You make a non-contingent offer, but they don't have HOA docs and they do not have the prelim. They then give you the HOA docs and the prelim. Do you have 5 days to back out? Badal's got his hand up. He's the only one, I think, that actually did what I asked. And I hate to say, the answer is no, you do not have 5 days. You don't. If you remove the investigation contingency and they give you you're rolling the dice that there's nothing in the HOA docs or the prelim that's going to scare you. Now, you might have noticed I mentioned HOA and prelim, but I didn't say the whole seller documents because there's a difference between the transfer disclosure statement and the HOA documents in the prelim. And the difference between the transfer disclosure statement and the others is that it says in the California Civil Code that this cannot be waived. So it doesn't matter if they don't give you the TDS or they amend the transfer disclosure statement, you have 5 days to back out. But if they don't give you the HOA documents or the prelim or the copy of the solar lease or any of that other kind of stuff, and you've removed the investigation contingency, you're just taking a risk. You don't have a right to back out. Does that make sense to everybody? So, yeah.
No, and Michael, I don't know where the hand raising is, so I'm sorry. I guess I was ignorant on that.
That's all right.
Why is that, Michael? I thought that there was 5 days for the required information. And if you look at the HOA, as you used as an example, the HOA docs need to be provided. I thought the line item in the contract show that they have, if let's say someone doesn't give you something and then they do give you something, that you have 5 days automatically.
Not if you removed all your contingencies. If you use the contingency removal form and you check the third box that says the buyer hereby removes any and all contingencies, you have removed the HOA, the prelim contingency. And can you remove a contingency without having the documents? Can you remove the investigation contingency without having a property inspection, a termite inspection, or anything? The answer is sure. I've had buyers do it because they were planning on tearing down the house. They didn't care, so they didn't make a contingent offer. If you make a non-contingent with the investigation contingent, if you remove all your contingencies, you're saying, I don't care what the HOA documents say. I do not care what the prelim says. You're taking a risk. The only one that you really can't do that with is the transfer disclosure statement. Because it says that this is a right that cannot be waived. It's line 2 of section 1102 of the California Civil Code. This cannot be waived, but the others can be waived. Your right to review the HOA documents can be waived. Your right to review the prelim can be waived. And that's what you do when you make a non-contingent offer. So don't do it unless you have everything that's important to the buyer. This is commonly misunderstood, right? You've waived it, but you can't waive the TDS. And by the way, a twist on that, I'm involved in a transaction right now. It's a $2.7 million property. No contingencies. There were 5 offers. I'm in Silicon Valley. What do you expect? They had all the inspections and reports, but the seller bought the property earlier this year, like in January, something like that, fixed it up, and then put it on the market. Does anybody know why that piece of information is important?
Yes, because you have to include all of the people involved, their licenses, and the permits for the work that was done.
And very good, very good. You get the cookie that I give out at the end. There's and you know what part, this is a little bit of the California Civil Code, that it's called the flipper rule, that is part of, what part of the California Civil Code. It's got a name as well as a code number. I know, you did well with the first one. It's 1102 of the California Civil Code, which is the transfer disclosure law. So the flipper law is part of the transfer disclosure law, and that cannot be waived. Can't be waived by the buyer upfront. So even though we removed all the contingencies, as I've been explaining to the listing agent, that doesn't mean you don't have to do this. And if you don't do this at the beginning and you do it later, it's an amendment to the transfer disclosure statement, which triggers a 5-day right of rescission that cannot be waived by the buyer. My client can get out and get their money back, even though they bought the property without any contingencies. And by the way, they're having difficulty giving us all the requirements under the flipper law, even if they do give us everything, that which includes the final sign-offs and all of the permits and the names of everyone who did the work. Even if they do that, we can still get out, because we have 5 days from when we get receipt of their amendment of the TDS. So removing the contingency of investigation, we still have an escape hatch. And by the way, I always look, if I represent the buyer, and the listing agent isn't online, so I can say this, they also screwed up the TDS in that when they were asked questions about, is there anything in common, any features in common, the seller said no, but they're fences. And are there any easements on the property? The seller said no, but I bet PG&E has them. Now, those are trivial things. However, the transfer disclosure law is not flexible. It says that if the seller becomes aware of any inaccuracies in the transfer disclosure statement, they have to amend it. And once they amend it, it triggers a 5-day right of rescission. And although there's a good faith part for the purchase agreement, using the investigation contingency in good faith, there's no good faith part of the TDS, except that the seller has to use good faith in filling it out. There's no requirement that the buyer use good faith when they back out. I always look at the TDS because I'm looking for something like this. And if I see it, I don't mention it to the listing agent. Now, I mentioned the other one to the listing agent because we really want to talk to the contractors. But if something goes south, we still have another escape hatch, even though we don't have any contingencies. Any questions about that?
Michael, in regards to the flipper, I hope this is pertinent at this time. In regards to the flipper, if there were a problem after the close of sale, close of escrow and title, would the buyer go back to the seller if there were an issue, or would they go back to the contractor that did the work?
My client be that very question. I heard a growling noise. Was that my stomach? No. So my client asked me that very question, and the answer is you can go to the contractor. First of all, as I'm sure you all know, the residential purchase agreement requires that the seller transfer all warranties to the buyer of the property. And the California codes require that contractors warrant their work, and depending upon the kind of work they did, for example, structural work, it's like 10 years, other work, it's 5 years, some of it is 3 years. So even if the contractor says, I don't offer a warranty, the law says you do. So the contractor would still be liable for that work. The contract transfers the right to the buyer, and the California statutes say you have a right. You have a warranty. Right.
Thank you. You can have my cookie for your tummy.
All right, thank you. Review of leased or liened items. There's something about this particular contingency that is different from all other contingencies. And I would ask if anybody knows what that is, but I don't want to, I don't know, we have to finish it, that's the only contingency that says that this is a contingency for both the buyer and seller. And what that says is that if there's, mostly we're talking about solar panels, in some parts they're propane tanks and things like that that are leased or have a lien on them. And it says that you have to, if you're the seller, give copies of the lease or the liens to the buyer. And the buyer's willingness and ability to take over that or accept those is a contingency for both the buyer and the seller. So if one won't do it, the other one can also back out. In other words, it's not that the buyer can say, well, I don't accept it because I don't want to take over the solar lease. Then the seller can back out. Right. It's one of the few times, and PACE and HERO loans are special loan. We have a class on shining the light on solar panels. And these are essentially loans that have to be paid off before escrow closes. It can't be paid off with the proceeds from escrow closing. And that means if you have a PACE loan, somebody has to put in the money to pay off that loan, or you won't close, which I'm not going to, default timelines, whichever is later rule. So if you don't change anything, it says 17 days, which is longer than you probably need for inspections unless there's something interesting, or 5 days after delivery. So you don't give them the TDS until 15 days, they have 5 days, right? Whichever is later. Managing the life cycle. You need to, we use software because there's a specific number of days. And when I pull up my calendar, I see a whole list of things from the different escrows we have about when contingencies are being removed. You need to, pay attention to that. The point of no return is the active removal with the form C.A.R, which we're going to look at. When you sign that one, remember, pretty much the only escape hatch left to you is the transfer disclosure statement being amended or not being given. What if the buyer won't remove their contingencies? It's called the notice to perform, and it's a 2-day notice. The old form used to say 2 or blank days. And so what sneaky real estate agents would do, so I've heard, is that next to the 2 days or blank, they would write in 10 because most listing agents didn't look at it. And so then the buyer is not removing their contingency and the agent is filling out the notice to perform and it says 2 days and the buyer agent says, what do you mean 2 days? Look carefully, it says you have to give us 10 days notice. That's gone. Right now, it's hardwired, you get 2 days to perform. If the day of performance falls on a holiday or weekend, it rolls over to the next business day. That's what that says. And if they don't perform in the 2 days, the seller has a right to cancel, but they don't have to. A lot of times, most of the times when I've given a notice to perform, we didn't cancel when it wasn't met. But you see, at that moment, we could cancel anytime we wanted to, because the 2 days came and went and they didn't do anything about it. The firewall, if you give them the 2-day notice to perform because they didn't remove their contingencies and you cancel, you give them their deposit back. Remember, the only time the seller keeps the deposit is if the contingency is removed and you still don't close. Well, what if the contingencies are removed? You wouldn't use a notice to the buyer to perform, but they're not closing anyhow. Now it's called a demand to close escrow. That's a 3-day notice. And again, the buyer's agent can't write in another number because they used to do that too. So I've heard. So we only use the demand to close escrow if we've already removed all the contingencies and they can't close. Now you understand, this is like, I used to use the metaphor, it's like nuclear war, mutually assured destruction. Does the seller want to cancel escrow and the listing agent, do they want to cancel escrow and start all over again looking for another buyer? The answer is no, they probably don't. So that's all they can do, right? If you don't remove the contingencies and they give you the 2-day notice to reform and you say, look, we're still not going to remove the contingencies because we haven't figured out the loan yet and we've got other issues, we've got contractors giving us bids, we aren't going to do it. What are they going to do? Cancel? Start all over? So if they think you still have a chance of closing, they'll usually give you some days, but they don't have to. Advanced scenarios, repairs. I didn't include this, but there is a contingency removal section in the repair request. And the repair request doesn't necessarily mean you have to ask the seller to fix stuff. It could be that you ask the seller to give you a credit because stuff needs to be fixed. And within that form, you can say, if you agree to do this, give us $20,000 credit or whatever it is you're asking, we remove our investigation contingency. You can do that in that form. I don't have a copy of it, but it's available. You should find it. So here are some of the other crazy ones. Sale of buyer's property. One of the more disliked forms called the COP form. And this is where the buyer says, well, I'm only willing to buy your house, but only if I can sell my house. And that form, I'll show it, that one we're going to spend a couple of minutes on, but it's a form that could give the seller the right to kick out the buyer if they get another offer that doesn't have this contingency. By the way, this is one reason why you might look, if it's a tight market and you're having trouble finding properties to show your buyer, you look for contingent sales that have this contingency. Call the listing agent up, say, it's contingent. Is it buyer's property? I got a buyer that doesn't need to sell their property. They may be able to kick them out. The SPRP, we've got both of these going on sometimes in the same transaction. This is where it by the way, is most of the time at a 1031 exchange. Because in a 1031 exchange, the seller doesn't want to sell to you unless they can buy the property that they want to replace it with for the 1031 exchange. If that falls apart, then they don't want to sell because they have to have a replacement property in order to qualify for the 1031 exchange. Non-contingent offers. There's a form which we've signed. Now in Silicon Valley, particularly if the seller has all the inspections and all the reports and all the documents, and it's a hot market, and it's a hot market, they're expecting a non-contingent offer. They just are. Now, what the lawyers have said, not C.A.R. lawyers, but other lawyers that I've heard talk about this, is that you ought to let the buyer write up some contingent offers, not get the property because they had a contingent offer, and let them self-discover that this isn't going to work. I've modified that a little bit. So what I say to buyers is, lawyers have told me that I should let you write offers and not get the house and figure this out for yourself, so it was your idea, which we can do if you want to. Or let me just tell you what you are going to need to do if you're going to buy this house. They already had 5 offers, right? They already have 5 offers. And who gets the house the highest non-contingent offer? That's who gets the house, right? If you've got all the contingencies and no one else does. Now, if you're outside of Silicon Valley, most of the time the seller hasn't put together all the documents. If they don't have a termite, by the way, I'm happier when I'm working with my team members and I ask them, well, we're writing an offer. Does the seller have anything? Like, what do you mean? Well, is there a TDS and SPQ? Is there a termite report of property? No, they don't have any of that. Good. Good. By the way, what we might do, this is back to the dark arts, is we might make an offer without a loan or an appraisal contingency. Right? But we still have the investigation contingency. Remember, all we have to do is say we drove by the neighborhood at night and didn't like it, or we looked at the school rankings, or we find out there's bicycle thieves, or, plus they haven't given us anything. And if there's HOA documents, there's always something that you could, well, they won't let me rent it out. Oh, they won't let me have more than 2 pets, or. So as long as we have the investigation contingency, we've got the biggest escape hatch we could ask for. So we will remove the other contingency so it makes our offer look stronger, but if it doesn't appraise or we can't get the loan, we're using the big one to get out. Just saying, right? I prefer that they don't have everything, because that means they're not expecting a non-contingent offer. But if they've got everything and there's multiple offers, non-contingent is probably the only way to buy it. You're waiving investigation. Now, that doesn't mean you can't look at the property for informational purposes. Later today, I'm going to go to the property that we're in contract for, meeting a contractor with the buyers to take a look at it. Informational purposes, not a contingency. But it says in the purchase agreement, unless somebody changes the default, and no one ever changes this one, that you have 17 days for informational purposes. That includes measuring, maybe having a decorator look at it, or having a contractor that's specifically on the list. So we're going to go and meet a contractor, and we're going to do it again to have the asbestos inspection, the lead-based paint inspection. I think I covered this. Cancellation, if this is a nice little chart, if you haven't removed your loan or contingency, you get your money back if you cancel based on that. If the seller cancels because they gave the buyer a notice to perform and the buyer didn't perform, but it's still an open contingency, that means it hasn't been removed, you're going to get your money back. If you've removed the loan contingency and can't get a loan, you can lose your deposit. If the buyer refuses to close and they remove their contingencies, they have a chance to lose their deposit. It doesn't happen automatically. The contract says you have to go to mediation and then to arbitration. Let's look, because I've covered this little quiz there. So this is the residential purchase agreement. I don't have all the pages. I'm calling to your attention the section on loan amounts. Because if you have a loan contingency, you better write something in here. If it's an FHA or VA property, there is an appraisal contingency. Doesn't matter what box you check. There is an appraisal contingency. It's in the law. This is the list of contingencies. Notice the default is 17 days, but you would normally make it shorter because you really don't need 17 days to get a property inspection or a termite inspection. But maybe there's something you have to check with the building department whether or not you could put an addition. The two contingencies that you can move right here are loan and appraisal. All of these others, if you're going to remove them, you would attach the C.A.R. form, which is the contingency removal form. And then this I've included because this is the paragraph that talks about contingencies and removal of contingencies. And by the way, the reason I've got this here is because it sort of explains in detail, something for you to read, how this whole process works, but I've sort of summarized it in my previous. This is the contingent offer advisory, which basically says, we're telling you not to do it. Wink, wink, we're telling you not to do it. We're telling you you shouldn't do it. And we're telling you that you're not going to buy a house in Silicon Valley with multiple offers unless you do it, right? But this explains the risk. My buyer, by the way, knows the risk. They knew the risk. I was very clear as to what it meant. And as long as they say, yeah, we know, we get it. It's a crazy market. We want to buy the house. This is the buyer contingency removal form. This is the C.A.R. form. You'll notice that paragraph 2 has a long list. And you could go through and say, we're removing this one and removing that one, and we're not removing these. So if you check the boxes, you're removing the contingencies for the boxes you've checked. Listing agents do not prefer this form. Then you have paragraph 3, which is where you can check all buyer contingencies removed except. Notice investigation isn't necessarily on that list. You could check other and write it in, but this is where you're saying, okay, you got a termite, a property, and a roof, all that kind of stuff. We're good. We're not good. See, what I say to the buyer when they have all those reports, do you intend on hiring another property inspector, another termite inspector? And by the way, rather than doing that, as a tip, if you're representing the buyer, I would suggest that you read the termite inspection and the property inspection, and what you're looking for is anytime they say, we suggest that you get an electrician to look at the panel, we suggest you have a plumber look at the plumbing, because the property inspector is not going to give you, first of all, they're not contractors, and they're not going to tell you what it's going to cost to fix something. So rather than getting another property inspection that probably is going to say the same thing that the first property inspection said, why not get a contractor to look at the things? There's a crack in the foundation. Is it a serious crack? Is it not a serious crack? Who would know? Well, a contractor would know, right? But the property inspector doesn't know. So I don't personally think it's a good idea to just get another inspection, but to bring in the next level and get bids and have a real contractor look at the property. But this is where we could say we're removing all buyer contingencies except appraisal or except the loan or the contingency for selling our other property. And the one that listing agents like to see is number 4, buyer removes any and all buyer contingencies. If you do that, remember HOA, prelim, all of that is out. Any and all. Only thing that doesn't get removed is the transfer disclosure statement. Contingency for the sale of buyer's property. Notice paragraph 1 says buyer is entering into a contract for the sale and closing on buyer's property. That's the default. Now, what that really means is that it probably hasn't even been listed, right? So these are the different levels. The buyer wants to buy the listing, but they haven't even put the house on the market, the one they have to sell. That's the lowest level, because we don't know what they're going to list it for. We don't know if it's reasonable. We don't know if it's going to close. I mean, we don't know. Option two, it's already listed, but they don't have an offer yet. Well, that's a little bit better because at least we can run the comps and see, well, it's new to the market. It looks like it's well priced. Maybe we'll take a risk. Option three is we're in contract. Not only have we listed it, a buyer has made an offer and we've accepted the offer. Now the question is, does that contract have contingencies? Well, and if the answer is, well, yeah, well, we still don't feel very safe because maybe they're not going to go through with the deal because they can't get the loan, it doesn't appraise, they find something wrong. Best is we listed it, we have an offer, we're in contract, the contingencies are removed, we're closing in 2 weeks. Then that's not as much of a risk. Then you could use, if you represent the buyer, the estimated closing statement from the seller, right? Because you're the seller of that one, the one that the title company gives you to show proof of funds. You'll see that entering into a contract, buyer has so many days to sell the property. That means that if, and usually 17, it's hard to make it too much shorter depending on the market, but option number two is the buyer, or paragraph two is the buyer has a limited amount of time to sell their property. Paragraph three asks the question about, is it in the MLS? Where are we at in the transaction? That's essentially what 1, 2, and 3, my summary of the different stages, that's where that's disclosed. And if it's simply waiting for escrow to close, my thought sometimes is if the buyer has removed all their contingencies and you're just waiting for escrow to close, why do you need to make your purchase contingent upon that sale? If you're sure that everything is cool, why? Why? I don't know. Now, the part of this, let me just get to it, is paragraph 7. This is where all the quicksand is. Let's say you've sold the property, you represent the seller, the buyer has a contingency for the sale of the buyer's property, and somebody makes a better offer. What can you do? Well, it says that there's a particular time period. Notice it says 2 days, 48 hours. So depending upon which box you check, let's look at paragraph 3, because this is all where all of the hassle comes with. Paragraph C1 says that if you get a better offer, non-contingent, or just something you like that's better, you can give you have an immediate right if you're the seller to notify the buyer. Notice it says the buyer would have to remove that contingency and prove that they have the money without the sale of that property, which they probably can't. So if you're the seller, this gives you the most leverage, because if you get a better offer, you can give them a 48 notice. They'll not probably be able to come up with proof of funds, and you can kick them to the curb. What does the buyer want? Well, at least they would rather have option 2. And option 2 says, well, if you get a better offer, a higher offer, you got to give us, that says 17 days. You could write in another one. You got to give us 17 days notice to let us come up with the money, get ours into escrow, let us close. If you represent the buyer, you would really prefer this one, which is no right to kick us to the curb. You're stuck with us. You have to wait as long as it takes for us to, there's a limit at the top, but you can't just kick us to the curb because you got a better offer. Any questions about that? When I get asked questions about filling out this form, it's really always about 7C. Which do we pick? I'm not sure if that was, anyhow, I can see you're all happy about this. It's a hated form. Now, the rest of this, which one is this? All right. Contingency 2 of 2. Why did I put this here? This is part of the cancellation form. This is what happens if you cancel escrow. I should have put it in the first page. It might be later. I don't know. What happens? Well, release of funds is not automatic. Remember I mentioned that? Doesn't just go to the seller, doesn't just go back to the buyer, and you have to check boxes. Either the seller is going to release it or the buyer is going to release it. They almost never check that, or they compromise, or how about this? There is no deposit. So if you cancel before the deposit it is in escrow, there's not much they can do. Not much they can do. What else? Notice to the buyer to perform. This is the contingent. This is they didn't remove their contingency on time. You fill out the form, you check the boxes. It can be used for contractual actions. There's a whole bunch of things the buyer could not perform. Seller replacement. This is the one that you would always use probably in a 1031 exchange, but you could use it at other times where you're saying, if I can't close on this one, I don't want to sell that one. And this is the replacement property form. And then there's a seller contingency removal. The seller replacement property contingency is pretty much the only contingency that's on the seller side. And if the seller won't remove their contingency, this is the seller notice to perform. The list is a little bit shorter. But by the way, in my transaction, we're going back and forth over what that particular code says. If they don't give us, I gave them 24 hours yesterday, if they don't give us all the documents by the end of today, we're going to be, giving them a notice to perform. And then that's what the cancellation form looks like. And I'm done, I think. Any questions? If this all seems confusing to you, murky, difficult, talk to me about joining my team. I'd help you with it. That was my shameless plug. Vidal, did you have a short, what's going on in the loan market? Or interest rates back to below 4 yet?
Interestingly, interest rates little up than 2 weeks back. I think market did not accepted um, Fed's cut, so we are seeing little bit unusual rates right now. So not that much, just a 1/4% up right now. But
Did you put your contact information in the chat?
I'm just doing it right now.
So I want everybody to know, my client that I'm in contract with is about a $3 million property who I've worked with in the past and who I'm intending to work with again in the near future. Vidal's doing the loan, right? And my guy's got money, but it's always always tricky because of the way, well, it's a long story. But I just want everybody to realize that Vidal is the loan agent I use. And this is $2.76 million property. I'm just saying, right? And if you're looking for a good loan agent, and you always could use a second opinion, couldn't you? I would say, save Vidal's information.
Thank you. I'm sharing my detail right now,
Yeah.
and happy to connect with you guys.
Next week, we're going to do something else. I'm not sure which part, but I'm going to do more fun with forms. There's new laws. Isn't that fun to know that are coming into effect? Some of them really have an impact on real estate agents because there's a presumption that you know certain things that you may not know. And we're going to talk about that and how it might affect your transactions. I don't have the title, but next week there'll be more. All right. Have a good day, everybody. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Or not. And there we go. Bye.